So by now, we got components everywhere. We got the expenses component, expense item, expense date, app, yeah, a lot of components. But that really is what React is all about. Now, obviously, throughout this course, we're going to learn about more features which we can add to these components to make them more interactive, to improve their performance, to send HTTP requests, and much more. But in a nutshell, and that's really important, it's all about components. And it's about props for configuring these components, for passing data into them. And components really just are these custom HTML elements where you combine HTML code, JSX code to be precise, and styling, and if you want to, also extra JavaScript logic, as we're doing it in expense state. That is really what components are about. Now, I did mention it multiple times already. We build all these components to then build a user interface. And we are already doing that. In app.js, we're using expenses. In there, we are using expense item. In there, we're using expense state. Generally, this approach of building a user interface from smaller building blocks is called composition. Now, there's one specifically interesting aspect of composition which we haven't seen thus far though. What if we wanted to create a component which actually just serves as a shell around any kind of other content? At the moment, we have highly specific components. The expense date component is about outputting a date in exactly that format and in exactly that look. The expense item component is just about outputting an expense item. And in your React application, you will always have a lot of these very specific components. All these components are also just configured through props, through the date prop, the title prop, the amount prop, in the case of expense item, for example. And again, that is fairly standard. You'll have a lot of these components in your React applications. Sometimes, however, you want to have a component where you don't configure everything through props, but where instead you're able to pass content between the opening and closing tags of that component. And here's an example where this would make sense. If we have a look at our current output, then we see two kind of boxes or containers. We got a container around all the expense items. It has a light gray background and rounded corners and a slight drop shadow, which might be hard to see. And we have a container around the overall expenses list with a darker gray background, but also rounded corners and a slight drop shadow. Now, the idea behind all these components is to have reusable building blocks, also to avoid code duplication. And here at the moment, we at least have some style duplication, also maybe some HTML structure duplication. Expenses has a div which surrounds our expenses, which applies certain styles thanks to this class. And the same is true for expense item. Now, of course, not all divs have the same look though. Inside of our expense items, we also got divs like this one, which have a totally different look. Nonetheless, we could extract this surrounding container div, which we have both an expense item and expenses.js, and extract the styles they have in common, like rounded corners and a drop shadow, into a separate component. And we could name such a component card, because this is a specific card look. And this is not a term I came up with. Instead, in general, in web development, when you hear the term card, it typically means some kind of container look with rounded corners, drop shadows, and elements like this. So that's why I'm picking card as a name here. Now, such a card component is still a regular component here. So let's create it as such. But such a card component could now do one main thing. It could return a div or any other kind of container HTML element with a class name of, let's say, card. And then we could add a card CSS file and import that into that card component. So import card card.css. And now in the card CSS file, we could have, let's say, the box shadow and the border radius from expenses CSS. Maybe we would be able to extract more styles, but I'll go with these two. I'll cut them from expenses CSS and add them to card CSS inside of a card CSS class selector, which I added there. I will also go to expense item CSS, and here in expense item in this class selector, we also find a box shadow and a border radius. So I will remove these styles from there as well. Now, why am I doing that? Just to show this kind of component. Now we got this card container component, you could say, which should act as a shell around either our expense item content or our expenses content. And that's the key. This card component will now not be configured through some attributes. Instead, my idea would be that, let's say an expense item, we can simply replace this built-in div with our custom card component. And then we get these predefined styles for the card automatically. Maybe we then just want to make them extensible, but we get these predefined styles automatically. And for that, of course, we want to import card from ./card inside of expense item. The thing just is, if I save that, you will see that all the expense items are lost. And the reason for that is that out of the box, just like that, you can't use your custom components as wrappers around other kind of content. Having content between opening and closing tags doesn't work just like that. But of course it does work for built-in HTML elements like the div or the h2 tag. So it would be nice if we could also make it work for our custom components to build such reusable wrapper components like this, for example. And of course, React has a solution here. We can build such wrapper components. In card.js, we again want to accept props, but now, as I mentioned, we'll not work with some attributes, but instead we will use one special prop which is built into React, which every component receives, even if you're never setting it explicitly. And that's a prop which value I want to output between the opening and closing tag of this div inside of the card component function. It's the props children prop. Children is a reserved name. We don't set a children prop on this card. I'm setting a class name prop, and actually at the moment this won't do anything. But I'm not setting a children prop. Children, as I said, is a reserved name, and the value of this special children prop will always be the content between the opening and closing tags of your custom component. So in this case, this content between the opening and closing card tag, that is what will be available on props children inside of that card. And therefore, if I now save this, we got some content back. However, it's also a bit broken. And the reason for that is that I extracted some styles, which expense item and expenses had in common, but I had more styles defined for expense items, and these styles are important. But they are missing now. I am setting a class name prop on card here, but you must not forget that card is now a custom component defined by you. All the default HTML components out of the box support class name for adding CSS classes to the rendered HTML elements. But your custom components only support what you tell them to support. So if you want to make sure that a class name can be set on your card component and then has an effect, we have to tweak the code in the card component. And here we would probably want to tweak it such that we add whatever is set as a class name on card to this class name string we're setting as a class name on that div. So here we could add a classes constant, which is card as a default class, which is always applied, whitespace plus props class name. So now anything we receive as a class name from outside is added to that string. And here we can then dynamically point at this class's constant. So with that, we're now making sure that any value set on the class name prop is added to this long string of class names, which is then finally set on this div inside of the card. And with that, if we save that, we got the same look as before, not yet for expenses, but for the expense items. But now we have this reusable wrapper component. Now we can also use that in expenses now. Here, instead of using a div, we can also use our card component. We can import card from ./card and replace this div here with that card, still setting an extra class name here as well, and also replace the closing tag. And if we do that, now we get the rounded corners back on that expenses container as well. Now, why would we do that? What did we gain by doing that? Well, in this case, of course, not a whole lot, but we were able to extract some code duplication from inside our CSS files into this separate wrapper component. And it's not just a duplicate CSS code. We also were able to extract this HTML code, this JSX code, this div here. In this case, it's just one div. But throughout the course, you will also see more complex wrapper components, which might have a more complex JSX structure. Things like modals and alerts. And in such cases, being able to extract that often allows you to save a lot of code duplication, and it often allows you to keep your other components clean. And this is another aspect of composition. We compose our expense item component by using card as a wrapper, by using some built-in HTML elements, and by then also putting in the expense state. And all these components and elements are composed together to form the overall expense item component, which then again is used in other components to in the end overall build the overall user interface. So composition is important. You use it all the time when working with React. Whenever you combine components, you are using composition. And an especially important part of composition is this props children feature, which allows you to also create wrapper components, which is a special type of component, you could say, which you also sometimes need. Now again, as with all these things, you are of course going to see many more examples throughout the course.